I will say that for us personally, the theory of structural dissociation makes a lot of sense, and it does fit in with how we experience our DID. Hey there, and welcome back to our channel. On this channel, we discuss mental health with a special focus on how it affects us as a DID system. Today, we're going to explore the theory of structural dissociation. Now, this is the prevailing theory in modern day research when it comes to DID, and really looks at describing the structure of DID and how it forms. While it is the prevailing theory, and you will be hard pressed to find research articles that don't reference the theory of structural dissociation, not everybody agrees with the theory. Different people take different issues with it, and I just want to be aware of that before we dive in. We will, after talking about the theory, have some discussion about why people don't necessarily agree with it. Now, because we are talking about scientific theory, I am going to be referencing notes because I want to make sure I'm getting everything correctly. What I talk about is mostly based off of the information I was able to find off of didresearch.org, which I will link in the description. They took their information directly from The Haunted Self, which is the book in which this theory was presented. I did also do a little bit more research just to help flesh out some of what I'm talking about, but the bulk of it does come from didresearch.org. The basic foundations of this theory is the idea that everybody is born with parts. Children develop different ego states to get different needs met. And sometime between the ages of 6 to 9, they integrate these ego states into a cohesive personality. When we talk about the prevention of that integration, we're really talking about DID, which is kind of what this theory was created for, even though it does attempt to describe other forms of trauma-based disorders. So when talking about the prevention of integration, we're looking at DID and probably OSDD1. And if trauma occurs before the child is fully able to integrate those ego states remain separate and they never integrate into a cohesive personality. Now, where this deviates a little in other trauma-based disorders is in those other disorders, that personality may have been allowed to develop, but later trauma fails to integrate with that personality and therefore forms these other parts that may exist. And you'll understand what I'm talking about as we get further into the theory. When discussing this theory, it is important to look at how they define the different parts that exist. They really split them into two categories, which is ANPs, or apparently normal parts, and EPs, or emotional parts. Now, the ANPs tend to be rational and oriented in the present. They're the ones that handle everyday life. They tend to be extremely avoidant of trauma triggers and reminders. They use mechanisms of avoidance such as amnesia, loss of awareness or loss of sensations, and the limiting of or numbing of emotions, which is basically dissociation. And this avoidance can cause depression, anxiety, shame, rage, and other negative feelings. The emotional parts are the parts that contain the trauma. They hold on to information like memories, internalization of that trauma, trauma responses, etc. They often come forward during those trauma reminders and do not experience much of everyday life. They may be less developed than the ANP and may be frozen in time and often unaware of the present and often experience flashbacks. They might also reenact trauma, for example, through hypersexuality. They might be experienced by the ANP as different emotions, and they often act within the trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The theory does allow for this concept of mixed parts. It does not really go into detail about it in what I have been able to find, but it does acknowledge that in DID, there may be parts that don't fit exclusively in an ANP or EP category. They are often associated with severe childhood trauma that began at a very young age or was incorporated into everyday life. There's not enough differentiation in that part to be able to form an ANP and an EP. These may be parts that are trauma-based but are rational and grounded enough to function. They could also be neutral states who remember the trauma but aren't really connected to it. The theory of structural dissociation kind of divides experiences based on 3 different tiers: the primary structural dissociation, secondary structural dissociation, and tertiary structural dissociation. In primary structural dissociation, this occurs when the individual was fully able to integrate their personality, but they experienced a later trauma that failed to then integrate with that personality. They may occur in early childhood if it's not betrayal-based, not repeated, or the individual is not predisposed to dissociation. In primary structural dissociation, there is one apparently normal part and one emotional part. The ANP is responsible for daily life and is dissociated from the EP. The EP holds trauma that would prevent the ANP from functioning. The part responsible for trauma responses, or the EP, is not integrated with the ANP when it comes to everyday life. The primary disorder that falls into this category is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. In this case, the ANP is often numb or avoidant of reminders or triggers of the trauma. And when they are triggered, that is when the emotional part gets activated. If the emotional part does not really take control, then the ANP can receive it as intrusions, like intrusive thoughts or rumination and other things like that. If the EP does take control, then they can experience the trauma as if it is happening right now. And that is what a flashback is. And when the flashback is over, the ANP may not even remember that they had the flashback. Now, the EP can show up as flashbacks, hypervigilance, panic, irritability, emotional outbursts, nightmares, somatic symptoms, negative self-image, and others. There are dissociative disorders that kind of fall into this tier, although it has not been well researched. They really haven't looked at this theory as applied to dissociative disorders outside of OSDD1 and DID. It could be a place for depersonalization, derealization disorder here, where it's possible that the presence of an emotional part makes the ANP disconnected. And the ANP may have intellectual knowledge of the trauma, but have no emotional connection. Now, in dissociative amnesia, it's possible that the ANP does not experience any kind of intrusion from the EP. The EP contains all of the knowledge of the trauma. If the EP does intrude, it's through the same symptoms as PTSD. And I will mention that it's unclear how dissociative fugue, which is a subset of dissociative amnesia, would fit into this theory. In secondary structural dissociation, trauma occurs at an early age, and it is done by a family member or guardian, or it is paired with disorganized attachment. In this tier, there is one apparently normal part and multiple emotional parts. So that's where it differs from the primary structure, is that in the primary structural dissociation, there's only one emotional part. When you come to the secondary tier, you're looking at multiple emotional parts, but there still is only one apparently normal part. That ANP is responsible for everyday life, while the multiple emotional parts hold the trauma. These EPs may handle different, sometimes conflicting aspects of that same trauma. Each emotional part may have different memories, emotions, responses, internalized messages, and personal characteristics. Emotional parts might be more developed than the emotional part in primary structural dissociation. The first disorder that we see fall into this tier is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. And the thing with CPTSD is you can develop it in early childhood, or you can develop it as an adult. If you have adult onset, it's probably due to long repeated trauma like torture, captivity, war, or genocide. In childhood onset, you're looking at childhood trauma, and not only do you have that trauma, but it also increases the risk of additional trauma. And each additional trauma can kind of mingle with the unresolved past trauma and reinvoke old emotional parts or create new ones. In CPTSD, they're going to experience the parts similar to PTSD, except that instead of one emotional part, there's several. They may have more maladaptive behaviors, such as projection, identifying with the perpetrator of the abuse, holding positive feelings towards the perpetrator, obsession with revenge, and these may be different in different emotional parts. The next disorder that falls into this category, it presents similarly to CPTSD, and that's borderline personality disorder, or BPD. This is often associated with childhood trauma and dissociation, but one, research has shown that not everybody with BPD reports childhood trauma, and not everybody with BPD does experience dissociation. Now, in BPD, the presence of the emotional parts can be what causes those problematic symptoms, such as unstable identity, age regression, emotional instability, chronic feelings of emptiness, and impulsivity. The next disorder that falls into this category is OSDD1, or otherwise specified dissociative disorder. You may have seen OSDD1 separated between OSDD1A or OSDD1B, and it really just depends on how the parts manifest. It is the most complex disorder that's in the secondary tier. It's similar to DID and doesn't always fit cleanly into secondary structural dissociation. In OSDD1, the emotional parts are likely more developed than any other disorder that falls in the secondary tier, but not as developed as you see in DID. They may handle some daily life, such as play and exploration. They're often child parts. They can take control through passive influence or a full switch, which is when a part takes executive control of the body. They may deny one another and one another's memories. They might also reject certain aspects of the body or the current situation that the body is in. They can be grouped based on types of trauma, with each EP holding different aspects of the same trauma or different responses to that trauma. There might be an observing part who did witness the trauma but has no emotion or attachment to it. Tertiary structural dissociation is where you really get into the meat and potatoes of this theory, and it kind of seems like this is really what the theory was trying to get at from the very beginning. And in tertiary structural dissociation, we are talking about DID. There may be some manifestations of OSDD1 that fit into this category, but as we talk about the manifestations of the different parts, we're really looking at dissociative identity disorder. At this stage, the trauma occurs at a young age, lasts a long time, is done by a family member or guardian, and or involves disorganized attachment or predisposition to dissociation. Now, in this tier, there are multiple ANPs and multiple EPs, and that's where it separates itself from the other two tiers, is the fact that there's the existence of multiple ANPs. Now, these ANPs may handle different aspects of daily life. There's no single core ANP. The ANPs are highly avoidant of the emotional parts, and they do this through amnesia, dissociation, self-harm, and substance use. Because of dissociative barriers, they can interact with some EPs if they are aware of them without trauma bleed through. The ANPs may be unaware of each other, or they may think they are the same person. And an example of this would be before I was diagnosed, I would have experiences where I felt like I was outside of my body, and it goes beyond depersonalization because I was not the one who was in control of my actions, and I was still co-conscious, so I was still observing everything that was happening, but I was not the one controlling the body. But I had no concept of having multiple parts, so I still thought it was me, and that just something weird was going on. And so what was happening was it was in fact another part, but because I wasn't aware of that part, I still thought it was me, if that makes sense. Now, the emotional part can intrude on the ANP without a full switch, and it can cause anxiety, depression, chronic helplessness, shame, guilt, rage, and other negative emotions. The ANPs may struggle to form meaningful relationships and have a need to appear high functioning. The emotional parts at this level may handle different aspects of the same trauma. They are more complex and well developed than at the secondary tier, but there may be some parts that are a little more fragmented. They may see themselves at a range of ages and aren't necessarily stuck in time. They can handle certain aspects of daily life like play, exploration, and social activity, and may appear to be similar to ANPs. Now, they may be focused on trauma defense responses, specific emotions, or specific types of attachment. They are often grouped based on types of trauma, with some EPs experiencing different aspects of the same trauma. So how do these parts manifest in DID? Both the ANPs and EPs can manifest through passive influence or full switches. There may be time loss or blackouts that accompany these switches, but not always, and it can depend on the level of co-consciousness. It is common for all of the parts to deny each other's memories. They might even deny physical aspects of the body or their present situation. Certain parts might be resentful of the body's job, spouse, children, where they live, and different other aspects of that body's life. Disliked parts may be looked at with shame, blame, or hatred. On the flip side, there can be internal friendships and alliances between parts, some even developing as a family unit. These parts may not be aware of each other, but if they are, they may view those parts as completely different individuals and may see themselves as having no control over the other parts. They might acknowledge that they share a brain and a body, but still see the others as separate. They may have intellectual knowledge of history and trauma with no emotional connection to it. Even though DID develops in early childhood, in adulthood, you can still have different parts form. So both ANPs and EPs can develop in adulthood when you already have DID. In this case, EPs are most likely created from new trauma, whereas ANPs are most likely created through new responsibilities like childbirth or a new job. These new parts form when adaptive functions, memories, strong emotions, and perceptions cannot be integrated. Now, an important thing to note about the development of parts later in life is that a part cannot have information or skills that does not already exist in the body. For example, if I have never spoken German, I wasn't around it growing up, I never learned it, then a new part that forms can't suddenly be fluent in German. Now that we've gotten a kind of quick notes version of this theory, let's look at why some people may not necessarily agree with it. The first issue that we come across with this theory is that it really was designed for DID, and it places other disorders in different tiers, but not always cleanly. It's difficult to prove the existence of defined parts outside of DID and OSDD1. How do you know parts exist if they aren't actually coming forward and manifesting? And so it's hard to be able to say that, for example, BPD has these emotional parts when you can't really observe those parts. The theory is also not applied equally to other dissociative disorders. DPDR, which is depersonalization and derealization disorder, and dissociative amnesia get kind of jammed into that primary structural dissociation, but there's really not a lot of research there. And it definitely doesn't really look at other types of otherwise specified disorder. The other problem is, as I mentioned before, not everyone with BPD reports experiencing trauma. And so this theory really kind of ignores those people. And it also doesn't really explain how parts differentiate in BPD and CPTSD compared to OSDD and DID. And of course, like the biggest problem is that OSDD1 does not fit cleanly in secondary or tertiary structural dissociation. To the point about how do you know that these parts exist when you're not able to observe them, the other thing that this theory does not really do is explicitly define the difference between emotional parts and the ego states that everybody experiences. Everybody has this concept of a, who I am at work, who I am when I'm hanging out, who I am when I'm home alone, who I am at church, who I am with certain family members. And so these are different ego states, and you can really see how that gets defined when you look at internal family systems. They do a good job, I think, of really looking at how these ego states exist. Now, when it comes to these ego states, they are still part of an integrated personality. So how do you differentiate between those ego states and these emotional parts? And the theory doesn't really define that. The other issue that comes up with this theory is that it assumes that the integrated self is standard. It ignores non-pathological plurality and kind of suggests that final fusion is the preferred goal of treatment, which ignores functional multiplicity. Another issue is that research really is limited by nature of the theory. Now, we have been able to prove that distinct parts do show up on brain scans. There's also plenty of research to show that disorganized attachment in childhood strongly correlates with the development of trauma-based disorders. Because of this, a lot of treatment models are in place following the theory, but how do you prove that children are born with parts that get integrated if not interrupted by trauma? It would be unethical to perform the kind of research necessary to be able to prove that. Another issue that a lot of people have is that this is the theory of structural dissociation, not the law of structural dissociation, which means it hasn't been proven enough or supported enough to really be more than a we think this is what's happening. And despite that, it does kind of get accepted as law in the community. Practitioners tend to accept the model without addressing its challenges, and it's seen in the community as the true explanation of DID when it's actually a theory that it's almost impossible to prove. Many systems do not feel like structural dissociation matches their lived experience. I mentioned earlier internal family systems, or IFS. Now, this is something that I think that there's a way that you could integrate the two theories, but IFS does kind of have some arguments against this theory. Now, in IFS, it suggests, like I said, that everybody has parts. And in IFS, there is a core self that oversees those different parts. IFS is not without its own problems, but it can be seen as an argument that the separation of parts is pathological, which is intrinsic to the theory of structural dissociation. Now, I would be remiss if I talked about this theory without talking the problematic nature of one of its creators. Onno Van der Hart is a co-author of The Haunted Self, which is where this theory gets introduced. He lost his license in 2019 due to mistreating a patient. And I think it's important to take a little detour and explore this story. Now, Van der Hart had been treating a client for 20 years, and during that time sent thousands of messages telling her how special she was and how much she meant to him. This is already crossing a huge boundary when it comes to a therapeutic relationship. The disciplinary committee that oversaw his trial, for lack of a better word, found that he did not follow basic treatment guidelines. He admitted in emails to the patient that he did not address her trauma, and the patient says that he would often talk to her about his own trauma and interpersonal problems. He would give her gifts. He would display inconsistent behavior. He would hug and hold her, which the Dutch Code of Conduct only allows handshakes. And he never asked if she actually wanted those hugs. There was a physical altercation between the patient and Van der Hart, And during that altercation, she broke her wrist. The other thing is that he was making home visits for her therapy appointments, which that is, I don't love that idea. Other people may have other opinions when it comes to therapeutic home visits. I think in some cases it's necessary, but in other cases I think that could already be crossing a boundary. The way that he terminated their therapeutic relationship is he sent her an email in 2015 saying that he wasn't going to treat her anymore. He did also conduct a few final sessions, and it's important to note that when he was sending this email, he acknowledged that he had not addressed her trauma and had not provided even basic treatment for her. He did offer an additional 6 months of treatment with him if she did not report him. Luckily, she did not take that offer, and she does explain her experience as emotional abuse. Sorry for the change in camera and the quality of the sound. I had to switch to my phone because my camera battery died, and I knew if I waited till my battery charged again, I would forget where I left off. I think it's important to look at the therapists that are creating the theories, because if a therapist is acting unethical in their practice, then it's very likely that they're acting unethically in their research. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. It doesn't necessarily discredit the theory outright, and he did not work on the theory alone, but it does make me look at it with a little bit more suspicion. And that's just the way that I consume information, is I'm always looking for the motives behind why the person put that information out there. Very rarely do people go into research without any kind of bias. You know, in basic research, you're supposed to have an objective or non-hypothesis. And unfortunately, based on human nature, what tends to happen is instead of having a actually like non-biased approach to your research, you tend to look at the data in a way that's going to confirm your objective or your hypothesis. This is called confirmation bias. And so that's why I always want to look at the intentions behind any kind of research or theory. And somebody who was that unethical in their practice, even though they were seen as kind of this international expert in the field, it makes me a little squeamish. That's, again, not to say that that completely means we have to throw the theory completely away. I will say that for us personally, the theory of structural dissociation makes a lot of sense, and it does fit in with how we experience our DID and, you know, the development that caused that. And I do think that it's a great explanation for DID. I don't necessarily agree with the primary and secondary tiers. I think it's trying to force certain disorders into a structure that they don't necessarily fit in. I think it does a good job of describing how I experienced DID, and because that's initially what it was designed to do, I think that's kind of where its value is. I wouldn't necessarily personally apply the theory to the other disorders that are mentioned in it, with the exception of OSDD, but I would put that in the same tier as DID. I'm not understanding how OSDD got put into the secondary tier when the parts in OSDD are clearly more differentiated than you would see in CPTSD or BPD. And again, this is all just coming from my personal opinion and my own research and my own experience. I am not a professional. I am not a doctor in the field. I am not a researcher by trade. I am simply a girl with a hyperfixation on psychology. And so those are just my thoughts and opinions on it. I also recognize that there are systems in the community that do not resonate with this theory, and I am not going to say that their experiences are wrong. I do want to do another video that kind of looks at the core theory, which was the original view that we had of DID formation, and see how it compares to structural dissociation. So look out for, that should be my next video, and I'll talk a little bit more about how those theories apply to lived experience. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Does the theory of structural dissociation fall in line with how you experience your plurality? And did you even know about structural dissociation? And how do you feel about it being the prevailing theory in DID research and the DID online community? Thanks for hanging out with me, and until next time, take care and stay well.